Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's IGAC ECR seminar. Today we have two speakers, and the first one is Kristen Okorn from NASA, who is going to talk about satellite and airborne measurements. Kristen, please.
All right. Thank you so much to those of you who are here, and thank you so much to our organizers. I think we've been going back and forth for almost a year now trying to schedule this, so I'm very excited to finally be here presenting to the IGAC Early Career Group. And yeah, I'll jump right into it. I'm going to talk about how we added low-cost sensors for air quality on the ground during some satellite and airborne missions and kind of seeing what else we could learn from those additions. So sorry, I'm out of order here. So yeah, to introduce the sensors that we use a little bit, these are air quality sensors that we built in-house in our lab. And they're built using designs that were developed during my grad school experience at SUNY Boulder. And so we have a photo here on the left of these. Just briefly, we have an electrochemical ozone sensor and a metal oxide ozone sensor and two metal oxide VOC sensors. So we use those to look at species-heated VOCs like methane and formaldehyde. A CO2 sensor is a gold non-dispersive infrared one in the center here, if you can see my mouse. And then we have these two electrochemical sensors on the bottom for CO and NO2, although those are not as used as much in this specific work that I'm going to be talking about. And then we have two photos here on the other side of the sensors during deployment. I'll talk about this in a few slides, but you'll notice here in the background, we have Pandora spectrometers, which are a ground-based remote sensing instrument. And then on this one on the far right over here, there's also a TCON spectrometer, so another ground-based remote sensing instrument that we co-located with the sensors to kind of have more information on the surface in addition to the column measurements from those instruments. So a little bit about the deployment. I mentioned that this was during the Aroma flight campaign in Los Angeles. So this was during the summer of 2023. And so as I mentioned, we had co-located with all of the Pandoras in California and also both of the TCON instruments. So there are 4 additional Pandoras in California that are kind of outside the range here that aren't included in this work. But we did co-locate with all of them to kind of better understand the surface to column ratio. And then in addition to those Pandora and TCON, so the kind of the ground-based remote sensing coincident placements, we had also placed sensors at different locations in the Los Angeles basin where they would have coincidence with the DC-8, so the NASA aircraft during this flight campaign. You can see on the plot on the right here, it's kind of one of the typical flight tracks. This isn't the only flight path, but you get a good sense of where these spirals happen, where the DC-8 would fly very close to the surface. So we get basically like an in situ kind of column from that, although not all the way to the surface. So we had quite a few sensors located with those, and then just a few other locations where we would get pretty consistent like flyover data as well. And I guess with it being Los Angeles, there is pretty good regulatory monitoring in the area. On the map on the left here, I have the regulatory monitors for formaldehyde. This isn't very dense, but kind of for a lot of different regional areas, this is actually pretty good coverage for formaldehyde. They also have a lot of ozone monitoring as well that we're able to leverage in this work. So with the low-cost sensors, something that folks are always concerned about is, how accurate they are. And I mean, rightfully so. There are, it's a much cheaper price point, maybe around $1,000 or less each. So they're not quite as reliable as some of, the regulatory monitoring that we would see. So I have a little bit of a dive here on how we do the calibration process to kind of ensure that the data is trustworthy. And for this specific set of sensors, we pretty much always do some kind of machine learning enabled calibration. For this specific set, it was kind of an aging fleet of sensors where we had some additional noisiness and issues that we don't normally run into. So for this, we employed a model stacking approach. It's a little more involved than we normally need to do for the sensors, but just given kind of some of the constraints on this deployment, we felt that was necessary in this case. And so how we calibrate these is always co-locating at least one of them with a regulatory grade instrument, either that we own at NASA Ames or again with one of those local partners in the Los Angeles basin. And so the first step of that is from this co-location process where the sensor and the regulatory monitor are both breathing the same air. We want to create basically a machine learning enabled calibration. So in this case, it was just a simple linear regression and applying it to the raw data from the sensor, or pod as we call it here. And so you can see on this first plot on the side here, the blue data is from Picaro, so that's our trustworthy reference instrument, and then the red is the linear regression estimate from the sensors. And you can see it does capture the baselines really well, but it's missing entirely, like really all of the spikes in the data that we see, which is really important. especially for methane that I'm showing here, we kind of care more about the spikes in some cases than the baseline data. So we knew that we needed to do some additional steps in order to capture that as well. And so what we ended up doing is then calculating the residuals between the reference and this estimate. So kind of what's highlighted in yellow here is kind of the spikes that we were missing from this initial estimate. And then kind of the third step in this is to basically create another model that's fit on these residuals. So now the yellow is kind of what was the residual, what was highlighted in that previous plot, and the purple is now kind of the secondary calibration that we've done. So fitting a model to the residuals. It still doesn't capture 100% of the spikes, but we are at least recognizing that there are spikes and getting kind of a good amount of the magnitude there. So we felt this was, a much better improvement on that. And then the final step is basically to sum that initial linear regression with the random forest model. So kind of that's where the model stacking comes in. It's taking the combined outputs and putting them together to get the final collocation estimate. So here, the Bacaro data, which is kind of our reference instrument, is still blue, but we now have the green, which is that stacked estimate, so the linear regression plus the random forest model. And again, doesn't do a perfect job of capturing the spikes, but we do at least now recognize both the baselines and that there are spikes occurring. So this was kind of the best model that we could do, kind of given the constraints here. I have some similar examples cited in the corner there. This isn't an entirely new machine learning method, but I haven't really seen it applied to the sensors before. So I was excited to be able to leverage this and get a better calibration for some of these. And then the final step in here is then applying it to the field data, which I'll show some more examples of on the next, or I guess 2 slides down from here. So for just a little note on the calibration results, we saw the best fits for CO2 and ozone. This isn't surprising, just kind of the mechanisms of how the sensors work. These usually are some of the easier ones to fit, especially for the speciated hydrocarbons, because they're just cross-sensitive to a ton of other hydrocarbons. The fits are usually a little bit worse just because there can be a lot more variation in what the sensors are picking up on. So here, basically on the left, I have just an R squared. This is for each of the different sensors, so that's why it's a box plot. For formaldehyde, there was only one of the sensors collocated with the reference instrument, and then we just had to apply that calibration out to all of the sensors, so that's why the ranges here are much smaller. It's only one being presented here. But yeah, so I mean, consistently really high fits for ozone, kind of ranging from, about 0.9 to 0.95. So basically we're able to explain, 90 to 95% of the variation in the reference instrument with the sensor. So is it as good as having another, Picaro? No, but it is pretty close. And you can see from the root mean square error on the side as well, the errors are pretty small. And so we feel confident that even with some imperfections, this data can still be useful. I'll note too for formaldehyde, this is obviously the weakest fit of about 0.6, so only explaining about 60% of the variability in the reference instrument with our sensor. But given that there's so little regulatory formaldehyde monitoring and just not in general a lot of higher quality instruments on the ground for that, we've been a bit more willing to work with that just because of a lack of other instruments. I think there's things that we could do, and we kind of learned from this experience, I think, to improve that for the future, but just kind of given the state of the availability of formaldehyde monitoring now, we've kind of been, been able to work with it just for lack of other measurements. So from here, I'm basically just showing some validation results. So on each of these, the blue data is from the nearest regulatory or just kind of more expensive, more trustworthy air quality monitoring instrument nearby to the sensors once they were actually deployed out in the field. So this is not from that initial when they're placed side by side for the calibration. This is once they're actually deployed and just the closest reference monitor that we could find nearby. And then again, the in-step data from our sensors is in the red. And so you can see for each of these, there's a little bit more variation in the methane here. But really across the board, I just kind of picked a week or two here to kind of show the trends so you could see it in more detail. But they do fit really well. Given that the sensors here are not directly co-located with the reference instrument, we do expect to see some variation because they might be, I think I tried to pick ones that were within about 800 meters of the sensor, but there could be, variation within that scale. But so overall, this was really promising and we felt pretty good about the calibration. Some of these calibrations were done in the Bay Area at NASA Ames with our instrument and then traveled down a few hundred miles to Los Angeles for the deployment. So that was also a really good sign to us about how robust the model was, that we were able to move to a different pollutant and temperature and humidity mix and still see similar results. So this was really promising and made us feel good about kind of the state of the sensors. Yes, it's not, again, as good as having another regulatory instrument, but these are pretty good fits and, shows a lot of confidence in the data as well. So from there, I'm then going to jump into some kind of comparisons and some of the actual data on the ground. So first, I have just a comparison of the sensors themselves, and then I'll dive into some of the column to surface and some of those other, remote sensing and the airborne measurements as well. So just like I guess a quick overview of what we have here. This left side of the panel and the colors is for each of the sensors. You'll notice for two of them that we didn't have for one of them, for two of the pollutants, we didn't have a good VOC sensor. One of the sensors malfunctioned, so we weren't able to produce either of the speciated hydrocarbons at the Redland site, but the rest of them, we kind of have the full suite. But for the hydrocarbons in general, the medians are actually very similar across the sites, but the actual distribution in these plots, so kind of the profile of each of these violent plots shows the distribution of the measurements across the study period. Both the ranges and the distributions vary quite a lot for each of these, so that was interesting and kind of speaks to the local sources at each of the sites and the meteorology a bit as well. I'll just note here that Whittier and Caltech are the two that are kind of fully in the Los Angeles basin. And then AFRC is a bit out in the desert above. And then TMF, Table Mountain Facility, which is a JPL facility, is up kind of in the hills between the Los Angeles basin and that AFRC desert site. So these are pretty distinct biomes that we're sampling, except for, the two that are both in the valley. So it does make sense to us that like the distributions and the ranges for Whittier and Caltech look the most similar, while the other ones vary a lot, especially as it comes to the hydrocarbons. If we kind of then move down to the ozone plot on the bottom left here, the distributions are all quite different, and it does speak a lot to the ozone formation chemistry at each site. I won't go into a ton of detail, but just kind of knowing the local sources of, Whittier, Caltech, and Redlands are more traffic dominated, and then the other two, are more kind of removed from that. We do see pretty strong differences there, and it speaks a bit to the reaction pathways for the ozone, which is pretty interesting. And then the thing that I have on the kind of the right side here in the grayscale, we looked at a bit of a deeper dive at the Table Mountain facility. As I mentioned, it's kind of up in the hills, kind of above the valley. And so the interesting thing about this site is because it's so much higher elevation-wise than the Los Angeles basin, it actually kind of is outside of the boundary layer, especially at the nighttime, and it's thought to sample the free troposphere just because it's so much higher. So it is impacted a lot during the daytime from pollution from the basin, but then at night it's the free troposphere. And so we just wanted to highlight some of the differences there. And I guess part of the reason for this too is we had placed a sensor at this Table Mountain facility because there's a Pandora spectrometer there, which, as with any remote sensing, you're only going to get measurements during the daytime. So we were really interested to see some of the differences of the basin air during the day and then the troposphere air during the night. So this was interesting to dig into as well. From here, I'll then jump a little bit more into the Pandora comparison that we've done with some of these. So these are the three sites: Whittier, which is in the Los Angeles basin, NASA Armstrong, AFRC, which again is in the desert, and then this Table Mountain site again, where we had each of the sensors co-located directly with one of the Pandora instruments. And so the Pandora is, it does column measurements, but for a few species, it also produces a surface estimate. And so this is what we're showing here on the bottom panel, is the surface estimate, and then we've converted to ppb to have kind of similar units. And so again, the difference here, not only we get the nighttime data, but it also gives us an in situ example to try to kind of constrain some of the issues here. Really, with any remote sensing, the retrievals around dawn and dusk are always going to be a little bit suspect. You can see the error bars on each of these, especially at Whittier and Table Mountain, are pretty high around those. And so part of the hope here too was that we could use this surface data to kind of help constrain those and maybe bring those back down, especially Table Mountain. They look a bit high on the dawn and dusk. So using this in situ data to be able to constrain that might be useful. I did mention that the formaldehyde data from the sensors is, maybe not the most reliable out of all of them. But we have still been, able to glean something from it. We also see that kind of the diurnal cycle is a lot stronger in the Pandora measurements than we see in the sensor. So that's also something to note, that those might be biased higher differently in each of those. I'm not going to go through every single panel on here because it is a lot and quite overwhelming, but these are some of the data from the GC8 coincidences. So some of these are just flybys where the GC8 flew low and kind of passed over the sensor, and then others you can see, especially in the methane and the ozone, and I guess the CO2 as well, just everything but the formaldehyde. We had spirals for where the aircraft flew close to the surface, so we kind of get the full vertical profile. So that's the data in the black is the in situ measurements on board the aircraft. The pink data on the ground, or the magenta, is from the in-step sensors. And then there's a variety of other measurements here as well. Where there's a Pandora, we have that data on here. From the TCON, we have that data as well, kind of for comparison. And so we really do see for most of these, the in-step measurements at the surface don't perfectly match what we see in the vertical profile, but they are at least in family and kind of in the same range. I don't have it in here, but we did do a bit of a deeper dive looking at some of the wind data from these. And they do seem consistent that both changes in the vertical direction and just stronger winds a little bit higher up where the aircraft sits, kind of lowest looks like they came on most of these was about, for at least for the spirals, was about 1,000 meters. There is some difference there, and that kind of tends to explain the differences. But overall, this was a really good sanity check for us that we do kind of see consistent. You can kind of imagine, especially for these vertical profiles where they're kind of this L shape, that if they kind of continued being able to go a little bit further, we might kind of see that connecting the dots between our measurements and theirs. I guess the other thing to note here is that some of these are on the scale of, a flight is about 5 hours. So that is why we see a pretty large range of the in-step measurements for some of these. It's, kind of a significant portion of the day that we're seeing kind of the diurnal profile and the in-step measurements as well. And then just a note here too on the other remote sensing instruments. So the TCON and the kind of the known kind of background concentration, which is these red lines, we do see pretty good alignment among those as well. So this has been kind of an interesting check for us. And I guess one final thing to point out too here on the formaldehyde one specifically, the blue dots are the Pandora tropospheric column of formaldehyde, which doesn't really match with the in-step measurements that well. But then again, those green dots, which are the Pandora surface estimate, do. So that was a really good check for us as well, that even though the column was quite different, we are tracking pretty well with the surface estimates. So then I'm going to kind of take a jump here into data assimilation with, I think, just the amount of data that was available during this campaign. There's really quite a lot. And, I think with adding the sensors, part of the intention was rather than just gap filling with low cost sensors, when we're already in a very well sampled area, kind of what can be the value adds of having the sensors. And so this is kind of one of the final pieces that we've been looking at. This is not as complete as a lot of the other figures that I've shown. I think it's worth mentioning. It's an interesting discussion. So kind of having this suite of the ground-based sensors, so not only our sensors, but also regulatory monitors. I mentioned there's quite a bit more for ozone than for formaldehyde in the valley. So you see a lot of these on these plots kind of circled in red, those little dots there. But so kind of looking a step back at the whole valley, we have WRF-Chem data, which has, really high spatial coverage. It covers the whole valley, but there's much lower resolution. It's about 16 kilometers. So when we look at this one in the center of the WRF-Chem versus our sensors, it's not to say that either is wrong, but just, the WRF-Chem is sampling over a much larger area. So it's not going to pick up on, as many of the very hyper-specific sensors. I mean, a lot of the ozone sensors are purposely placed, kind of where they're expected to read higher for, community monitoring aspects. So there's going to be discrepancies there, but it, again, does give a surface estimate from WRF-Chem. Tempo satellite, this is kind of the first light data from Tempo starting. We have about August through October in this data set for these averages. And so again, very high spatial coverage. Relative to a lot of things, medium to even I would say high resolution of about, 2 to 4 or 5 kilometers. But again, doesn't give us the surface. There is this 0 to 2 kilometer ozone product that kind of estimates for the lowest part of the troposphere, but it's not giving us at the surface. So kind of constraining that to the surface is a big part of why we've been interested in the data assimilation piece here and kind of seeing if we combine WRF with our surface estimates or the surface monitors, can we kind of constrain that even further just to the surface? I mentioned the regulatory monitoring and then the in-step data as well. But so this is kind of the hope here. I guess the far left panel is if we took all of these surface monitors, so both the California Air Resources Board, CARB, which are the regulatory monitors, and our in-step sensors, and did an ordinary kriging. This is kind of the output that we got for that. I have this highlighted area in the center because that's where the majority of the sensors were, so that's what I've zoomed in on for the further analyses. You can kind of see the gradient. There's just not as many sensors kind of in the outer reaches of that. The middle panel, like I mentioned, is just the WRF-Chem surface ozone output with our sensors plotted over it to kind of see the differences. Some areas it aligns, some areas it doesn't, but again, it's just the difference in resolution. It's not to say that either is wrong. And then kind of this third panel on the left is really what we're working towards of doing these service predictions. So taking the WRF-Chem and the sensors and the Tempo product together and trying to basically have a better estimate of the surface ozone from that is really the goal here. And so we're still tweaking this model a bit, but this is kind of the hope for this moving forward, that we can take all of these different measurements that have really different coverage and resolutions, but kind of combine them to get the best of each and have a more accurate surface prediction from that. This is kind of just a quick thing here on the formaldehyde. We see in general weaker agreements among most of the measurements with this. For formaldehyde, we only have the total column from tempo, not this kind of lower, closer to the surface estimate. So obviously, this right panel here, it look pretty different. And I mean, just in general too, you can see there's a lot fewer monitors for formaldehyde, even though I would bet this is more formaldehyde monitoring than most major US cities have. It's not a very dense network to be able to do the same kind of analysis with. So kind of, I'm hoping to maybe dig into this on the, I guess, like the lower left corner here of where we have them clustered a bit more densely to look at some subpixel and pixel boundary estimates, but I don't think we'll be able to do the same kind of more, whole basin type of modeling that we're trying to do with the ozone data. And so that's kind of all I had here. I'm just kind of hoping to demonstrate that ground sensors can help improve these assessments even in already well-studied regions, and especially kind of getting at the surface to column. I think it's been really interesting having the sensors. So, obviously there's quite big discrepancies between, surface and column, but that has a lot of implications in health and exposure and things like that. And then with the interpolation, just noting that, more densely packed networks are ideal. And we do have another ozone deployment currently in the Central Valley, so a little bit east of where all these measurements are, but we have them much more densely packed. And so I'll be really excited to explore that as well, kind of as that data starts coming in. But yeah, that is all that I have. And yeah, again, thank you to the conveners for having me on.
Thank you, Kristen. That was very interesting. Does anybody have any questions for Kristen? You can either put them in a chat or unmute and ask them yourself. Jason.
Hi, nice job, Kristen. I had a question about, I guess, something that you didn't show, but your sensors have the capability to measure NO2. I was just wondering if you looked at that at all. I think I've worked with the electrochemical NO2 sensors before, and they had like an ozone interference, but I was just wondering how that went.
Yeah, and thanks for coming and for asking that, Jason. We looked a little bit at the NO2. I think one of the things that we struggled with, I mentioned for kind of the way that we do the calibration, is having the regulatory instrument next to it. And we just unfortunately didn't get very good data from the reference instrument. There was like some outages there where we have a very limited time series to work with. So I'm hoping to revisit that at some point and see if we can find more data somewhere. But just because we didn't have a good calibration, I haven't really done much with it because the raw data is just not very good without the calibration. But yeah, that's been a big disappointment that we haven't done as much. But I'm hoping to maybe revisit that at some point and see if we can improve that at all.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I guess I was wondering, with the aircraft measurements, how many of the ground-based measurements can you do compare to all of them during a flight, or like how do you compare to them? Is it only when they're flybys low that you can compare, or are you also comparing just like column-wise to see what the whole profile looks like?
So yeah, that's a good question. The way that I limited and I guess kind of defined a coincidence was it had to be within 1,000-meter radius. So I guess the aircraft coming within 1,000 meters of the ground site, and then about like a 2-hour window on either side. With some of these, like on some of the flight days, the pattern was like, do a spiral here, go to the next spot, do a spiral there, come back. So kind of trying to target all of them in the same time. But so if let's say maybe the spiral lasted, the spirals themselves are pretty short, but I guess if they were kind of repeat coming back and forth, like some of these might represent more than one spiral. So that's kind of how we define the coincidence. But yeah, I have been thinking, especially I guess for the ones like formaldehyde, where it's just like they periodically will fly over it. I've tried to think about if it, might make more sense to split it differently than just keeping multiple, kind of flybys in the same one. But at that point, the data becomes a bit sparse. But then obviously here, like especially on this lower panel for formaldehyde, it's quite a lot of data. It might be too much. So yeah, I think I'm still trying to figure out if there's a better way to do that split, but that's kind of how we nominally define the coincidence is within 1,000 meter radius and within about 2 hours of the same time period.
Yeah, I think also with aircraft measurements and ground, when you try and compare them, it's sometimes quite difficult because it can be different air masses that you're sampling, depending on how high up you go.
Yeah, and so yeah, I don't have it on here, but we do have like the vertical wind speed from the DC-8, so I've incorporated that. It does explain some of the discrepancies on days that there's much stronger verticals. We kind of took that to mean separate air masses. But yeah, I mean even at 1,000 meters for most of the spirals, like it's still you're correct. That could be a very different air mass in there as well.
Okay. Has anyone come up with a question? Caroline, I think.
Yeah. Thanks for your nice presentation. I was wondering in the beginning when you showed the calibrations and when you showed that the in situ instruments didn't show the spikes, if that is an artifact of like time resolution that you don't capture them, or what the reason might be that the high cost sensor captures the spikes, but the low cost sensor doesn't get it.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. It shouldn't be time averaging. I don't think I mentioned, but both of these are minute average instruments. So both the Caro and the sensors are minute average. I think just kind of the mechanism of how the sensors work, because especially for this is methane shown here, because they're sensitive to so many. I mean, it's really like their sensitivity to quite a lot of other hydrocarbons. I think it can be very difficult in this kind of very noisy raw sensor signal to pick out like what is just methane and what is the other ones. And so it's kind of struggles, and that is really I think where a lot of the issues with the spikes comes in. If there's oftentimes a lot of other hydrocarbons being co-emitted, that it struggles to say, okay, this spike is methane versus this is a different compound. So I attribute a lot of it to that. I guess like the range of the sensors should be able to pick up on it, but just given that there's such a diverse pollutant mix, especially in this area, it struggles to, I guess, kind of figure out what's what. It does a good job generally with the baselines, but it struggles then with those higher spikes of is this methane? Is this formaldehyde? Is this biogenic? Like those types of compounds, it really struggles with the larger spikes to capture.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then we'll move on to our second speaker of the day, who is Shakiba Talebian from the University of Alberta, who's a PhD student and will be talking about forest fire emissions in Canada.
Just 1 second. I think now you have my slides. Yes?
Yes.
Great. Okay. And good afternoon, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for joining today. My name is Shakiba Talebian, and I'm a PhD candidate in environmental chemistry at the University of Alberta. I work with Dr. Ran Zhao and Jason Alford. So today, I want to share what work we did in 2024 Biomass Burning in Canada campaign, which we call it BBCAN. And I want to connect it to a bigger picture why the emission factors are important for climate, air quality, and human health. Sorry. Okay. So the talk has 4 short parts. The first is why biomass burning matter. Second, what are the emission factors and why they set a limit on what we can predict. And third, why we focus on Canadian boreal fuels. And finally, the BBCAN campaign itself and experimental setup we had and the first results that we got. So let's start with the first question, why biomass burning matters. So biomass burning is important for us because it can impact on three major system like climate. So, as we know, fires, they can emit greenhouse gases and methane, for example, CO2 and black carbon and brown carbon, and they can absorb light and warm the atmosphere. And second is air quality. Air quality. And so, as we know, fires, they will emit PM 2.5, NOx, and VOCs. They can make ozone, secondary organic aerosols, and these emissions, they can actually transport kilometers. And the third is human health. Fine particles are linked to the respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, and the age smoke aerosols has high oxidative potential, which can damage the cells. And also there is a newer pathway being studied, bioaerosols, which are living microorganisms carried inside the smoke. So one source, but three major impacts. And now I want to explain when we are saying biomass burning, what do we actually mean? So biomass burning has two main sources, and both are important. The first one on the left is the natural sources, and one example is wildfire. Which can be forest, grass, and peatland burning. They are episodic and landscape scale with a smoke that travels far downwind. And as we will see, this source is increasing. We are seeing lots of fires happening. And the other source on the right is the domestic burning, for example, cow dung, wood, and charcoal burning every day in households. About 3 billion people worldwide rely on these fuels, and the exposure here is chronic and indoor, mostly affecting women and children. So one source is natural and the other one is anthropogenic, but chemically both contribute to the global biomass burning budget. So let me show you why this matters, and with a recent example we have from wildfire that happened in Canada in 2023. So in 2023, 15 million hectares was burned in Canada. That is more than double that previous record, 6.7 million hectares in 1989. And these fires release 640 teragram carbon. This is comparable to annual fossil fuel emissions of large industrial countries. And the total emissions from 2023 were about 8 times larger than the average from 1989 to 2022. So the dash line here is showing the average, and you can see that it was 8 times more the carbon, the CO2 which was emitted from wildfire in 2023. So the takeaway here is that the model, they can track the smoke well, but to calculate how much pollutant that the smoke carries, they need emission factors. And most of these emission factors that it was not coming from Canadian fuels. They were borrowed from studies done in other countries. So transport was right, but the chemistry behind it was uncertain. The same is true for other fuels. For example, cow dung. Without good emission factor, we cannot make a good estimate the impact of what we are burning as a cooking fuels. And that is exactly the gap we are trying to address. In the next slide, I will talk about the question that we have, that what is the emission factors. So an emission factor is a mass of the pollutant we are looking divided by the mass of the fuel it was burned. So on the left, you can see the equation that fire inventories use. Total emission of the species X, it can be any pollutants, is calculated by four things. A is the area it was burned, the fuel loading, and the combustion completeness, and the emission factor. So that's first, the area burn and the fuel loading, the combustion completeness. These are coming from satellite and remote sensing, which is right. But the emission factors, they are fuel and combustion phase specific, and they can be varied in different phases. And this difference can be in order of the magnitude. And also, the studies that have been done previously, the order of the emission factor reporters, it can be varied like order of 2. And also we should note that for the fuels that it was not studies till now, when they are trying to calculate the emissions, they are using other fuels. So it's important to try to calculate the emission factors for fuels that they are underrepresented. So there are 3 ways that we can calculate emission factors: satellite remote sensing, airborne field, and laboratory fire lab. So each of these, they have their trade-offs. Satellite gives us global coverage, but they cannot tell us which fuel is burning and separate the flaming and smoldering. Aircraft and field measurement, they can measure the real fires and real atmosphere, but the plume dilution make it a little hard for the calculation. And also the fuel can be unknown. But laboratory experiment, it will complete these 2 methods. You will be able to calculate the emission factor phase specific, like in smoldering, flaming, and also you can study different fuels. So as I said, all of them together, it will complete each other. And our study, like in BBCAN campaign, we focus on laboratory fire lab because we wanted to have the emission factor for different fuels and try to calculate the emission factor for different phases. So why we chose the Canadian boreal fuels? Because Canadian boreal fuels are underrepresented in the existing emission factor database. On the left, the number is telling the story. 25 to 30% of the boreal forest is covered by peatland, and this peatland holds about 64% of the total boreal carbon stock. So if Canadian peat burns, the potential carbon release is enormous. Most of the fuel consumption during Canadian wildfires, there are surface fuels, and burning of the surface fuels is the main contributor to wildfire carbon emissions. On the right, you can see me and my friend. We went to the Pelican Mountain in north of Alberta in Canada to collect some samples. And so we collect the samples, and this is the pictures that we have all of the fuels, not all of the fuels, but some of the fuels that we burned in BB can camping. We burned peatweed moss, peatweed mulch, grass, ponderosa pine. And also, I want to note that we also try to burn cow dung as a sample of domestic biomass fuel. But because of the short time, I'm not presenting the results we have for cow dung and more focusing on other fuels. So let me show you what we actually did. I know this looks a little complicated, but I will explain. So we had our scale here measuring the mass of the fuel. The emissions coming from fuels was going through the hood and to the sampling line. We had some gas analyzers, CO, CO2, methane, NOx, PTR, and SEAMS. We were collecting filters for ECOC analysis, and also this side we had lots of instrument for particle measurement. The important things I wanted to mention here is that every fuel passed through the same sampling line, same dilution, and same instrument. This setup help us to have a consistent emission factor calculation for different fuels and to be able to compare them. So before starting about the results we got, I want to also mention one important factor, modified combustion efficiency. Modified combustion efficiency is defined as the change in CO2 divided by the change in CO2 plus CO. So it's a simple ratio, but it's the best way we can actually separate the combustion phases. When MCE is above 0.9, combustion is dominated by the flaming, and when it drops below 0.9, smoldering becomes dominant. And why it matters? Because during the flaming, combustion is hot and CO2 is the main product, and NOx and SO2 also peaks. And during the smoldering, we have lower temperature and oxygen limited. So CO, methane, and non-methane organic carbons become evaluated, and ammonia can also peak during the smoldering. So every emission factors depends on the modified combustion efficiency, and the emission factor from the flaming and smoldering can be different in order of the magnitude. So in this bar, I'm showing you the modified combustion efficiency that we calculated for different fuels. You can see that peatweed moss, peatweed mulch, they are more in the smoldering part. Cow dung also considered in the smoldering part, but some fuels like ponderosa pine, mulch, grass, and surface material, they are more in the flaming phase. So now let me show you the actual result we got for emission factors. This slide shows the time evolution of two very different fuels. On the left is peatweed moss, and on the right is mulch. Before that, I should also acknowledge Amanda Hanashiro Morris. She's the first co-author of this work, and she did a huge amount of all of the analysis here. Okay, so if we look at the top of the graph, we have modified combustion efficiency, the black, and the red one is the mass of the fuel burn. So if we compare them, we will see that the peat was most of the time it was below 0.8, while for the mulch it was it reached 0.8, but it was more above 0.9. And it shows that actually peat, it was spending most of the time in the smoldering phase, while for mulch we had flaming and then smoldering. And like if you want to compare the time, like mulch was 15 minutes flaming and the rest was smoldering, but peat, like it was a few minutes flaming and an hour of smoldering. And so also if you look at the gas species here, the pattern is also consistent. Mulch except flaming fuel, so CO2, NOx, and SO2 are peaking during the flaming phase. And for peat is opposite, like it will emit more CO, methane, non-methane organic carbon and ammonia during the long smoldering phase. So the take-home message is simple. The combustion phase really controls everything. And let me like summarize the gas emission factors across different fuels in this slide. So this chart compares the gas phase emissions factor for CO2, non-methane organic carbon, and methane. I'm not showing the result for NOx and SO2. So if we look at the CO2, so before that, like the total is showing with this pattern. The solid blue is the smoldering and flaming is the orange. But I'm just talking about the total emission factors that we calculated. So if we look at the CO2 emission factors calculated for different fuels, we will see that the flaming dominant fuels like grass, mulch, and ponderosa pine are highest around like 1,300 gram per kilogram. Peat is lowest in CO2. This is exactly what we expect. More flaming means that more CO2. And if we look at the CO that we have, the order is completely reversed. Peat is the highest, and around 3 times more than the other ones, if you look at the numbers. And for non-methane organic carbon and methane also follow same pattern, like peat is the highest and non-methane organic carbon, it's about 10 times for peat in compare with mulch. And next slide, I will have the emission factors for the particle phase. So if we look at the figure 2, it's showing the emission factors calculated for PM10, PM2.5, OC, and EC. So EC is elemental carbon. It's the main component of the soot, and it will emit during the incomplete combustion. And for organic carbon, we have like it's more organic parts and they can absorb also in the yellowish part. So if we compare the compare the emission factors that we calculated for particle phase, we will see that the ESC, elemental carbon, is lower for the peat in compare with other fuels, and you can also see the same pattern for the filter that we collected. Like this one is peat with mulch, and you will see that it's the yellowish color. But for example, ponderosa pine or mulch, there are more black parts. So it means that they have higher EC in compare with peat. So I also want to mention like about the figure 1, which is showing the diameter of the particles we collected and the number of the particles. And you can see that, for example, mulch is having a relatively high number of the particles, but the diameter is smaller, and this will result to have lower emission factor of PM 2.5 because it's small. Even the higher you will have a high number, but the mass will be less in comparison with, for example, for example, for peat and mulch, peat with moss and peat with mulch, that you will have a higher diameter of the particles. Even the number is low, but it will result to have a higher PM 2.5. So I have 3 points I want to mention. The first, that is the emission factor or the primary source of uncertainty. Area burn and combustion completeness are reasonably like measured by the satellite, but the bottleneck is the emission factors, and to fix that we need to have the fuel specific and phase result laboratory measurement. And the second is that BBCAN is trying to extrapolate the fuels that we didn't have the data emission factors for them, for example, peat and cow dung. And it's important to try to calculate the emission factors for these kind of fuels that we don't have the database for them. And also, we should note that the smoldering phase drive distinct emission profiles. So during the smoldering phase, for example, peat, it will reduce lots of ammonia, VOCs, and organic carbon, and we should consider that. So I want to thank for from Dr. Ranjo and Jason Alford, Amanda, who did lots of work, and Jeannie Marshall was the she was actually helping a lot in during the fire lab, and all of the members in BBCAN campaign and family and friends. Do you have any questions? I would be happy to answer.
Thank you for a great presentation, Shakiba.
Thank
As
you.
Shakiba already said, the floor is now open for questions. You can either put them in the chat or raise your hand, unmute yourself. Bert.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the great presentation. I might have missed it, but you mentioned a couple times that it's important to address these data gaps, like the emission factors for cow dung burning. And I'm very curious on how big of a factor you estimate cow dung burning to be on a global scale compared to the other biomass burning sources.
So in comparison, like for the global, so for cow dung, because it's more indoor and it will be more in developing countries that are using these fuels for cooking, I think the most impact will be on the health sides. And like at the same time, I know there is lots of fuels, like huge numbers that huge mass of the cow dung is burned in like in India, in South Africa. But still, I think the impact in comparison with wildfire is not that much.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear because that's something that I don't really consider in my life, that cow dung is used for burning in households.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
really
When I
interesting.
first heard that, I was also surprised, but yeah, we should try to study more about this. So if there is any impact, we can stop immediately.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, when people model of like wildfires, they must have emission factors that they use in their models. Are they
Yeah.
very different from the emission factors that you get out of your study?
And they are, and like I don't know how, like it's in my mind. I don't have the percentage, but I can say that because it's coming from different fuels. For example, the like for Canada, for the wildfires that we have in Canada, so peat is burning, but the peat emission factor that we are getting from peat in Canada, it's different from the emission factors, for example, we are getting from uh, Indonesia. So this difference can actually have impact in modeling, um, but I don't know a number that I want to say like this is the percentage of impact. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So far they've just assumed that it's the same. So when there's a number for one kind of peat, then they use that for all peat, basically.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And it can bring like uncertainty in the model.
All right. There are other questions. There's one in the chat. For subterranean fires from peat deposits, can we work on the emission factors for these, noting the limited oxygen conditions versus lab conditions?
Um, so I don't know the meaning of subtree.
Subterranean. So my guess, I'm not an expert in this, is that this is a limited oxygen. So it's a fire that takes place under limited oxygen conditions, and whether you've
Conditions.
looked at that kind of stuff in the lab.
We didn't actually look, but actually it's really interesting because, for example, there are also some burning even during the winter time, zombie fires, exactly. Like during the winter time, like below the snow, there are some fires that it's happening. We didn't look inside. I think it will be challenging to have the same condition as zombie fires, but I think those also have lots of smoldering. I don't know if I answered your question. I think I didn't.
It's good enough answer. Are there any last questions for Shakiba today? Jason?
Hi, nice talk.
Hi, Jason.
So you definitely showed there's a difference with the emission factors between the smoldering and the flaming. And I think we kind of talked about it with how do we incorporate that into the modeling, but also like how do we, I guess, measure in the field, either satellite or airborne campaigns, how do we measure if the fire we're looking at, or I guess what percentage of it is flaming versus smoldering, and then how do we appropriately apply the different emission factors to that?
So, your question is if we are able, like when we are using, for example, measuring the pollutants in the aircraft, if we are able to separate the smoldering and flaming, and is that your question? Yeah.
Yeah, and how
So
do we,
I think for the like exactly one of the limitation for these measurements is that you cannot separate the flaming and smoldering because the real-time wildfire is happening, and so you are also like trying to collect the pollutants, and it's passing some, for example, I don't know, photochemistry can happen at the same time. They can be age and the dilution is different. So you are not able really to separate the smoldering from flaming during the like real measurement. But in the lab, because you have the control, it's much easier. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, if there are no last questions, then I will turn off the recording. And oh, there's one in the chat. So a link between forest types and emission factors.
There is. I think it will be a dependence on the what fuel is burning in the forest. For example, the boreal forest can be different from the grassland. If like you have grassland burning, the emission factor will be different.
Okay. I think that's it for today. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to Shakiba and Kristen for your great talks today.
Thank you so much for organizing.